Hello and welcome. Welcome to the second part of this series, this 5-part series, where I'm talking about the fundamental principles of syntropic agroforestry. In this session here, we'll talk about the regenerative principles. So the principles that are kind of given to us that we need to work. It's more like the macro principles. If you haven't watched the first part, I would highly advise you to watch that first part first. So, because it proposes an overview, it proposes a bit of a framework, and will help you to locate where that fits in the bigger picture. But in saying that as well, this is a self-standing, a self-explanatory session too. So it's really up to you. So those regen principles that I've mentioned on the first part, I kind of tend to see that there is 3 of them. There is our forest needs to be successional, our forest needs to be stratified, and our forest needs to be analogous. So what does that mean? So of course there is lots of things that come under all of those headings. So the idea today is just to complement a bit more, to perhaps bring a few of the points that I work in the courses to your idea of what they might mean and how they might relate to each other. So successional, it's perhaps the most talked about principle in syntropic agroforestry and in other holistic management, in other regen practices too. So what is successional? What does that mean? So successional, as I understand, it's basically a movement in time. So here is when our systems start to be just something that is 3D, that we've planted and it's here, but the idea is how is it moving through time? How is it developing? And if we relate it back then to photosynthesis and life, is how are we going to be moving that photosynthetic capacity, keeping it at its optimal level as much as we can, all the way to the end, basically, like a forest ecosystem would do. So that movement in time then plays kind of an interesting role because, theoretically it's quite easy to envision that, but in practice it's something that we have to allow ourselves to be in the time. And a lot of the times the things that we've designed and we have put a specific time frame under them, when it comes to the reality of our systems, those time frames are really thrown out into the open. I mean, for example, in some of my systems here, I've got bananas that they've been literally 1/2 meter tall for 3.5 years until they actually spring up, and now for the first time after 4.5 years, they are actually starting to produce. So when we're talking about that movement in time, we're also talking about the relationships of the different plants' life cycles, because the idea is how can we put different plants that have different life cycles in a time frame that one supports the other, and through our management we remove one so the other can keep moving. So it's a very fine balance. So, are we taking it too much? Are we leaving it too long for that photosynthetic capacity to keep at optimal levels? So this is usually where our design kind of falls into place, but that's really kind of a key principle in forest dynamics, where there is always another layer of succession to continue the process of accumulating that energy, that photosynthetic capacity, and keep it moving forward in a syntropic movement. Also, we have to remind ourselves that that succession, especially the speed of movement, it's very, very context specific. So I was saying, the banana, the piece of land that I've been working here for 4.5 years, which is highly degraded, it's pretty steep, so it doesn't really accumulate a lot of water. The banana tends to have a much slower progress than, for example, if I go in a more in a place that's a bit more alive. In theory, I should be producing a bunch after 12 to 18 months. Where here, it's been basically in some of the areas about 4 years. But in saying that, that context as well, once I've started to work in those systems, the next time I came around, because I first implemented some lines and then I came and put lines in the middle, that environment was already so much enriched that actually took me 2 years then to start producing the first bunches on that second line. So it's highly, highly context specific how fast that successional progress will move about. And again, it's kind of, I mean, we can take some soil analysis and try to understand those things, but there is a lot of variables that come into that. And there will also have some management capacities coming into it, the amount of resources. Perhaps if I had put lots of irrigation and lots of fertilizers and keep pumping, I would have been able to produce bananas. But we also have to remember that this is a process-based framework. Doesn't mean that we can't use fertilizer, we can't use irrigation. No, that's all on the table, and I think it's important to be on the table. That allow us to be more flexible or speed up or slow down the process. But the idea is that we are trying to work as much as possible with the processes in our systems. Also, and equally important, we gotta remember that there is also a very interesting successional movement that needs to happen, which is in our minds and in our experience. We have to, as we move along, I mean, that one of the key, let's say, not principles, but one of the key ideas is that the Syntropic Agroforestry framework, what it wants to achieve, it's a system without any external inputs. And that's fine. But if you remove all the inputs, what are we bringing in? For us to be able, in my experience, for us to be able to remove all of those external inputs, we must become a very experienced farmer or gardener or land manager to be able to move with the system and bring life processes into the equation. And that takes time. You know, there's no questions about it. I mean, there's a lot of people that, I mean, the conceptual framework is quite easy and beautiful to understand, but the experience part, it's really what matters. That's, in my understanding, that is where, you know, reality lies. Is actually we taking it out of the concepts and putting onto the land and planting our plants and managing and trying to understand how is life actually moving in this system and how can I participate to move it along. It's really easy to just tell people how to do it because the concepts are quite neat. But once you come into reality, things get a little bit blurry, a little bit muddy, a little bit too dry, a little bit too hot. And we have to understand that through our experience, through years of practice, we get better and better. And in that sense as well, we have to evolve in our minds, in our thought process, in our observation skills. This is a very, very important part of these successional stages, and there is no course that can really teach you that. I mean, I try to bring as much attention to that part because to me this is much more important than that, because you are managing and you're going to dictate this. You know, this is a movement that happens regardless. You know, it's a natural phenomenon, but how to speed it up, how to optimize that, we must include this. And you know, it's a matter of time. And the sooner we start planting, basically the sooner we start to work with those processes and optimize them. Of course, there's a lot more context into that, you know, all the systems of abundance and systems of accumulation and that stuff. But ideally, I just want to keep it in a bit more generic terms, that the successional movement is a movement in time. And of course, we manage that movement in time by managing in space. All right, so the next one that I just want to briefly point it out as well in this second part of the series is that our forest needs to be stratified. So as I mentioned before, so what does that mean? It means that we need to have layers in our forests that function like a battery. And by having different layers, we are then able to, one, capture as much sunlight as we can, but also retain it. And so a lot of people think about stratification as something that is related to the height of the plant, but not really. I mean, in the past, it used to be related to height, but now because we are bringing all of those plants from different parts of the world that have different kind of ecosystems relationship, now we are looking much more at our relationship to light. So a stratification is a relationship to light, is light related. Or if you flip it, is actually what's the desire of shade that that plant requires, or that plant wants to optimize its photosynthetic capacity. Unfortunately, today, if you look at, in the instructions of every plant, especially plant that produces food, it says plant in full sun. But that's not really the idea. I mean, most plants can perhaps handle full sun, but the question is that the place that that plant will photosynthesize at its highest capacity? And for a lot of plants, like you can see there's some citrus, some bananas here, some other things there, it might not be. They might prefer a little bit of shade. They might prefer a break in the intensity of the sunlight in a particular part of the time, or they might need a bit of extra light to trigger flowering and things like that. So we must remember that it's about the light. It's about how much light it's hitting that leaf, and of course that will influence the temperature and the water capacity of that system, but it's light related. It's not height related. We also have to remember that because we've been playing with those plants for a lot of time, we have done lots of, what I'm calling cultural treatments to those plants, be it grafting, be it selecting plants to be smaller, so be dwarf varieties, playing with hybrid plants, and just going through that selective process. We are then using those plants that might not have the same height as they used to be, or they might be selected to be able to cope with more light or cope with less light. And we really need to understand those specific cultivars and how they're going to be meeting our necessities for light, for time, and for space, because those nuances play a key role. Again, going back to the bananas here, where I have planted lots of dwarf bananas, and I'm reaching a point now because the idea to plant the dwarf bananas was because it was easy to manage, but they stay so short that they actually clog up this area here, while my later successional plants are wanting to fill in. So if I had used taller bananas, appropriate tall bananas varieties, I'll be able to keep producing bananas for much longer, and also have a layer of plants where I don't have it now, because I have plenty of eucalyptus going tall, but I've got a gap, which I wish I had that banana holding that gap and really inviting my jackfruits, my avocados and my mangoes to push all the way up. So very, very important consideration that I don't think we are paying enough attention when we are designing our systems. A banana is not a banana. There's a whole range of bananas, and that goes for every part, every type of fruits and nuts that we produce, depending on what cultural treatment we've applied on that. Also, what I've been learning more and more is that it needs to be climate appropriate. Each forest, if you're going to compare an arboreal forest to a temperate forest to a tropical forest, once you look at them, they have a very different structure on how high they go, also how layers they are, and how sparse those trees are. And I think it's one of the issues that we are facing with Syntropic Agroforestry in translating that into colder climates or drier climates or whatnot, is that the framework that always proposes 4 layers, lines every 5 meters, in those different climates, they might not actually be appropriate. So we really need to be looking a little bit more carefully at the dynamics, the climatic dynamics that will allow us to then optimize photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is also temperature related. So if things might be too dense on a cold climate, it takes a while to warm that spot, but it's also water related. So how are we playing with the structure of our forest will really allow us to play with both temperature and water holding capacity. Some places we just want the water to flush a bit quicker, whereas some places we want it to retain it. So that's very important that we understand that relationship and how we organize in our spatial dynamics, so we are able to what? Going back, we are able to optimize photosynthesis. That is the game, is optimizing photosynthesis. Production, regeneration, anything else comes after that. Right, and just on the last principle that I just want to mention, which is one I think it's not really well perhaps understood or definitely not well talked about. It's hard to find information about, what is it meant by an analogous forest. I mean, even that word for the English-speaking people that I've, constantly talked to, is still not a word that is so familiar. So analogous to me, it's something that has a similarity too. So, in this place that I am here, or wherever you are, the idea is for us to be optimizing our photosynthetic capacity. We need to understand what kind of ecosystem function that forest needs to fulfill in order to be resilient. Because it's not only about this tree or that pine nut or this peach or that banana. We have to understand that those systems go way beyond the plants. We gotta be thinking about the processes that involve what? The producers, yes, our plants, but also the consumers. We are one of the consumers, but we have a range of animals that we have to invite into our system because they fulfill a key function in sustaining those plants. Be it trees, be it be it veggies, we need a range of fauna to be part of that game. And then the third concept, the third aspect of that is how is that decomposition process be taking place. So again, I find that there is a lot of focus on the plants, and I think that's great. I think that's where we begin, but we also have to understand the other dynamics. And what I'm observing here in this place that I've now been 4.5 years, and we came here was pretty dead. How important does the insects and the frogs and the snakes, once you start to creating that habitat and you start to change that habitat, what an important function they play in keeping that system resilient, in keeping that system healthy. So really, we have to start to go out of our plant dynamics and move into the fauna dynamics. And very important as well, it's how that material that we will be producing a lot of, it's kind of part of the game, is to produce a lot of biomass. How is that organic matter going to be decomposed? And that will change. It's not one size fits all. It's not just let's produce more and more organic matter and put it on the lines. That's not going to happen, because the decomposition of the organic matter requires what? Requires an appropriate temperature, requires an appropriate moisture content. So we need to structure those forestry systems that they allow the decompositions to happen. Otherwise, sooner or later, we just cover in organic matter. If you are in a place that, for example, is really dry, that you put a log on the ground and that log is likely to stay there for 20 years just oxidizing, that's not gonna work. So we have to put strategies in place that allow for that composition to happen. And if that's gonna be using animals, or if that's going to be using softer materials, if that's going to be by processing the lignified material through a wood chipper, there are many strategies that will be suitable to different people in different landscapes that will facilitate that. But we have to try and think that our systems will be related to a macro ecosystem. And it needs to fulfill a function that supports that, because then it will be supported by it and will give a resilience over time. So that will definitely then dictate, and it will relate to those other principles that I've just talked, that will help us to then decide what kind of forestry structure do we want, for that recycling and productive and consumptive systems to be functioning properly, because if they're not, then photosynthetic capacity will decrease. It's a given. There is no point of having wood chips all the way to my head and nothing really happening. So we need to balance production and consumption and decomposition. It's a bit of an art form, but we go a lot deeper in the course and how we gonna look at those specific variables and how each one of us actually needs to find where that kind of harmonious balance really lies. This will then, of course, determine our plant communities. Which plants do we have and which plants do we have in each part of time and how we organize them structurally, which is really important. For example, one thing that I'm dealing with here, do we use native plants? Do we use exotic plants? So what kind of community are we trying to create that will fulfill that function? And I think the best is to bring all kinds of plants that are used to that ecosystem function, to that ecosystem dynamics. I don't really care if my plants are natives or if they are exotics, as long as they are willing to work, as long as they are capable of handling my situation, especially when the climate moves into the polarities. It's quite easy when you have a mild year, but I think everybody in this day and age has experienced a lot of extremes. And once you start to move into the extremes, then those plants that are not really adapted to that particular climate dynamics, they struggle. They really do struggle. So yes, of course, those systems that are able to invite and maybe increase the range of plants that come in, absolutely. But they are not miracle systems that you can just put anything in any time. And to me, what I'm finding here is that combination of exotics and natives, it's very important, because the natives have all the affiliations, all the connections with the insects and the wildlife, which are very important, while the exotics might be able to fulfill a function that the natives can't, because it's either too degraded or because a particular kind of process is not happening, it's too wet, it's too dry, it's too something. But so they help to create the environment for the natives to thrive. And I'm finding that to be very, very important. Finding that combination of the exotics powerhouse, which once it's undermanaged, they are just sweet. But you have to find there is some exotics that are just too much of a powerhouse for me or too much for you. So it's not just, I'll put all those big guns here and things will be right. Absolutely not. Because if you can't manage those really powerful plants, you will have a problem. But also not forgetting that the natives, the endemic plants, they play a bigger role, a much, much bigger role of bringing all those connections into a proper ecosystem function. And finally, we have also to think that, that ecosystem function has a bit of a time frame. And that's what I'm really finding here where I am, for example, because through a lot of degradation of the environment, a lot of use of fire from the previous, from the Aboriginal people, but also then taken to the next level once the white people came, we are dealing with ecosystems that are highly degraded. But at the same time, this is a climate which is really a rainforest climate. But if I just come and use rainforest processes without any kind of plants that can handle today's conditions, which much more into a dry sclerophyll condition, especially on that land which is west facing, so it really, really hits up and dries quick, it's steep. So if I just bring rainforest plants, because that's what I think that ecosystem here is, and it is, I will breathe really slow. So to me, there is not only a combination between natives and exotics, but a combination of plants that can handle today's reality, because today's reality, I need today's photosynthesis, but then can also, as the system moves and flips around, can handle tomorrow's reality, which is going to be much more moist, with less light flickering through. So there is that time frame aspect that we need to start to put our plants, what can handle today and what will handle tomorrow. So that's about it for this video. I hope it makes sense. Of course, there is a lot more into each of those principles and how we play with them, and how you find plants that are appropriate for you, how find plants that you can handle, that you can manage, that can support your conditions, and also plants that will allow you to move it forward, because that's the idea. And yeah, I think once again, if that makes sense to you, I'm really hoping that it helps you. If there is any part of it that it doesn't make sense, that you'd like to ask a question, please do so. I'm always learning and trying to expand on those relationships. If there is something you've noticed that I've missed as well, please fire away, and we will keep that conversation going. In our next one, I'll talk about the other side. So what I'm calling them a productive principles, which are the principles that we have a bit more control, let's say. So we have those macro natural forces that we will have to play with them regardless. And then there is the other side of the coin, which is what can we do to then turn those regenerative processes that are there into a productive process too, and find that balance in between. All right, so I hope to see you into the next one, and let me know how things go. Take it easy. Have a wonderful day. Bye.